Good morning. Lovely to see you on this Thursday morning. Hope you are well and cheerful today, and welcome to our morning talk from Penn Vicarage here this morning. Well, I have a confession this morning. We are working our way, as you know, through 1 Corinthians, and we're in the first half of chapter 11 this morning, and I've got a confession to make. But given this morning's reading, it does feel a bit like being given a hand grenade with a pin taken out. It feels as though it could explode in many directions, and if I come out unscathed, I'll be a lucky man. So please bear with me. I'm actually going to start this morning, you'll see why in a bit, chapter 10, verse 31. I'm going to start the very end of chapter 10, and I'm going to read up to chapter 11, verse 16. Here goes. Brace yourselves. I'm going to put my hard helmet on, flat jacket and everything. Here goes. I'm starting at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 31. Paul writes, "So whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do everything for the glory of God. Give no offence to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, so they may be saved. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions just as I handed them on to you. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the husband is the head of his wife, and God is the head of Christ. Any man who prays or prophesies with something on his head disgraces his head. But any woman who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled disgraces her head. It is one and the same thing as having her head shaved. For if a woman will not veil herself, then she should cut off her hair. But if it's disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or to be shaved, she should wear a veil. For a man ought not to have his head veiled, since he is the image and reflection of God. But woman is the reflection of man. Indeed, man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for the sake of woman, but woman for the sake of man. For this reason, a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, or man independent of woman. For just as woman came from man, so man comes from woman. But all things come from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head unveiled? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears his long hair, it's degrading to him? But if a woman has long hair, it's her glory, for her hair is given to her as a covering. But if anyone is disposed to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God." And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Crawl yourself out of that one, Vicar. Well, this is a very, very contentious passage, as you can imagine, and I'll give it my best shot this morning. If you want to know more about it, I refer you to Dave Allen's lecture, the one I referred to the other day when we talked about same-sex relations in 1 Corinthians 7 a few days ago. I'll put the link at the bottom, look at it again, and Dave has some very, very interesting insights into this passage. Right, I think to understand this passage, you've got to understand two things. You've got to understand Paul, and you've got to understand Corinth. As I say, this is my take on it, and I'll give it my best shot this morning. What do we know about Paul? First to remember with Paul is that Paul had been a Jew, a fanatical Jew, really a fanatical Jew. And it was because he was so Jewish and so fanatical of his Jewish faith that he persecuted the church. It was against everything he stood for. And then, one day, horror of horrors, on his way to Damascus to persecute some more Christians, he has an encounter with the risen Jesus. And I cannot overstate what a massive thing this was for Paul. And I think from there on in, Jesus Christ for him was the Messiah. The risen, crucified and risen Christ was what everything was all about. And I think for Paul, from there on in, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the fact that Jesus Christ is the main one, that is the main thing. And everywhere he went, that was his supreme concern. As he said to the Corinthians, I resolved to know nothing when I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And for Paul, I believe, Jesus Christ is absolutely the center of everything it's all about. And everything else, including same-sex relationships between men and women, and so on, it's all secondary to that. And I believe some of it is somewhat fair game. As he said this morning, judge for yourselves. Is it right for a woman to, and so on, okay? So for Paul, Jesus Christ, him crucified and risen, that is his number one. And that is everything that he's all about. I think the second thing is, when Paul met Jesus Christ, it wasn't something he was looking for. Definitely not. And it certainly wasn't something he wanted. But when he met Jesus, everything changed for him. And I think he spent the rest of his life coming to terms with what the Messiahship and the resurrection of Jesus meant. He had to rethink everything he'd ever learned before. And I think he spent the rest of his life working through the ramifications of that. And so sometimes Paul, if he works out his theology a bit kind of on the hoof. He works things out as he goes because his new situations and what does it mean? What does the resurrection of Jesus mean to that? Which is why I think sometimes Paul gets himself a bit tied up in knots from time to time because he's working it out as he goes. He knows Jesus is alive. He knows Jesus is the Messiah. But working out what that means in the practicalities of life, I believe, was a lifelong thing for Paul. So, what do we understand about Paul? Jesus Christ is number one. That's the main thing. And secondly, I think he's working it out, which why I think from time to time he kind of gets himself tied up a bit in knots. He says some things to one people and other issues to other people because he's working it out as he goes throughout his life. So that's what we think we know about Paul. The second thing I think you need to understand is the Corinthians. Now, I believe in Corinth, despite the reputation that the church often has today for being conservative and old-fashioned and so on, I believe the Corinthian church was years and years and years ahead of the curve on this one. In a society where men and women would worship separately in different parts of the synagogue, men and women were clearly worshipping together. In a society, patriarchal society, where only men would speak and only men would teach, here you've got a place where, like it or not, men and women are both speaking and prophesying and praying in church. It is clearly happening. So you've got a Christian church which is streets and streets and streets ahead of the curve when it comes to this type of thing. But I believe Paul's responding to a letter, some correspondence to him in the Corinth. This is clearly a problem. And the problem is this. The Corinthians knew that there is freedom in Christ. Christ has set us free. That's absolutely right. But, and as a result, as I said, they're worshipping together and all this type of stuff. Women were speaking in church and all that. But it was creating a problem. In those days, as I understand it, respectable women would wear a veil over their heads. Not a face thing, but a veil over their head to cover their hair. It was a sign of respectability. And the only people, I believe, as I understand it, in Corinth who didn't wear a veil over their head were either high-class mistresses or temple prostitutes. The other people who didn't wear were slaves and they had their head shaved. So what Paul is saying is, you're enjoying your freedom in Christ, but by not wearing a veil on your head, A, you're making yourselves look like temple prostitutes, making yourself look like high-class mistresses, which isn't a good thing. Also, I believe it caused a certain amount of hurt to your husbands as well, because they're married to you and you are their glory, and therefore be the glory for them. And I believe what Paul is saying here is that we have freedom in Christ. Men and women are one. Men and women are dependent on each other. The whole thing is very much about interdependency. Men are not better than women. Women are not better than men. But in this particular context, it doesn't do the gospel any good, the reputation of the gospel any good, and it's a distraction if by not wearing a veil, you look like a load of temple prostitutes or high-class mistresses. So what Paul is saying is, we have freedom in Christ, but don't let your freedom be a distraction. If not wearing a veil is an impediment to the gospel, then for goodness sake, I think he's saying, just put a veil on for that, because you don't want anything to distract from the gospel. Jesus Christ and him crucified is the number one. The church of Jesus Christ, Paul is desperate. He wants it to flourish, and he doesn't want anything to stand in the way of it. So what he's saying is, you have freedom, of course, but don't let your freedom be an impediment to the gospel. Phew. I think, as I understand it, it goes like this. For Paul, Jesus Christ and him crucified was the number one, and anything else is secondary. So it's actually not that big an issue. Secondly, I believe Paul does, to some extent, work his theology out as he goes along, because he's coming to terms with this massive revelation that Jesus Christ is alive. And I think also the situation about head coverings here is a one for the Corinthians. They're a church which is miles and miles ahead of the curve. And they've got freedom, and they're enjoying the freedom. But he says, enjoy your freedom, but don't let your freedom stand in the way of the gospel. I hope that makes a degree of sense. Read it through your leisure if you wish.